Okay, welcome to the second lecture of this mini course on human rights. We have a fairly busy schedule today, so I call for your utmost attention because we'll have to cover a little bit of important yet not immediately easy stuff, especially when we will be discussing Jeremy Waldron's paper on dignity as a potential foundation of human rights, which was the reading assigned for today, along with John Simon's reply to that, which I'm afraid I won't be able to discuss in details. But before we move to Waldron and his extremely lucid, yet perhaps a little bit problematic account, I wanted to go back to the tripartition that we mainly were concerned with yesterday, between on the one hand the instrumental or reductive, using Tasula's terminology, orientation and the foundation of human rights, non-instrumental or orthodox, and to be still analyzed is the political or practice-based approach. So I briefly, we remember the instrumental orientation. It's all about the goods or values, right? An R there, that human rights protect. As long as we have an interest in those values or goods, we are bound to be interested and to recognize the normativity of human rights. That would be the instrumental orientation. The non-instrumental makes no reference to goods or values we have an interest in, but is more concerned with recognizing a status that humans possess, so reference to human dignity, reference to human worth. And as I was trying to show yesterday, that's the weakness of the orthodox approach as it is practiced today. No explanation of why humans have this worth, no account of the reasons that justify the idea that we are dignitary entities. Third and last main orientation, of course there are a little bit of overlapping. Tasula's, for example, who is one of the major theoreticians of human rights, sometimes put in the non-instrumental category, sometimes in the instrumental one, because he has a pluralistic approach. Remember, it's okay to keep human dignity as a necessary part of the foundation, but we won't be able to get to the human rights as we know them without some consideration of the interest that we have, which dictates how you move from this abstract notion of human dignity to the concrete and specified human rights that we have in the list and the official documents. So you need to know what humans need in order to decide what you want to insert in the list of human rights, even if your ultimate goal is that of protecting the status that humans have. So that's, in very crude and simplistic terms, the pluralistic approach, which of course puts people either in the instrumental side or in the orthodox side, depending on whether you give priority to the non-instrumental side of their approach or to the instrumental side of their approach. Okay, so what can we say about the last orientation? As I told you, an increasing... Yes?
Sorry, just before going to the last...
Yeah, sure.
Could you repeat the objection that you have to this compatibilist?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
The objection I have against pluralism is that it conflates the true question that a foundation should be after with a question that is almost technical. That is, how do we protect this dignitary status that we have decided humans have? I tend to consider this an empirical or quasi-technical question, because what interests me, at least mainly, if I am engaging in the business of a foundation, is to understand precisely why the interest or needs of human beings are worthy of attention, why humans deserve to have their interest taken into consideration. I've nothing against a focus on interest. I'm simply saying that the question of how you translate an assumption about the fact that we have worth into specific provisions that meet our needs lays at a very different level in the philosophical inquiry, as opposed to the main question, which is the only one that attracts me, that has to do with the reasons why we take as a given, or the reason that we have for thinking that the interests of human beings are worthy of protection. I think that the real question that the Foundation is after is this one, not the translation of, once you have proven, once you have shown that humans have a right, that the overarching right to have their interests taken into consideration by the state, that you cannot go below a certain threshold of respect for human beings. Once you have gotten that, which is the main question, then the question of specification of human rights that need to be included in order to meet the basic needs of human beings remains at a different level of inquiry. I'm not sure, if I have to be completely honest, whether, even if you accept my distinction between these two levels, the second question is a purely technical one. I don't think so, honestly, and I think that there is philosophical work to be done also to specify what dignity requires and what are the fundamental interests of human beings. Of course, I mean, it's like, going back to the question of what is human nature, or what are the capabilities. It's there are many philosophers who have made a career out of this second question that I'm asking. So I'm not saying it's a purely technical one. All I want to establish is that there is a difference between the two. And in the pluralistic approach, it seems that the second question, for the sake of a foundation of human rights, is considered as important as the first, which is something that I resist. Okay?
Okay, we may discuss later.
All right, so as I was saying, an increasing number of scholars today tend to be neither instrumentalist nor orthodox, and they side for what is called this practice-based or political approach. Names: John Rawls, Joseph Raz, that was mentioned by one of your colleagues yesterday, Charles Baez, Allen Buchanan, Samantha Besson, and perhaps to a certain extent also Thomas Pogge fall in this category. Although some of the things that Thomas Pogge says about the fact that human rights recognize pre-existing moral rights seem to be more in the orthodox category than in the political. Anyway, according to these authors, an interrogation mark about Pogge, the essence of human rights is to be found in the role that they play in the practice of international politics. So you see what human rights today do, as a matter of fact, within the practice of international politics, and that's the essence of human rights. There is nothing much more to be said about them, or if you want to answer the justification of human rights, then realizing the role that have come to play. And of course, one of the key features of the role that human rights play in international politics is, you should know by now, the limitation, the determination of the limits of national sovereignty. So probably the most important function that human rights today play is to determine when and on what conditions a state has legitimate authority over its people, or a government has legitimate authority over its people. If a state commits serious violation of human rights, it loses the authority that the international law by default assigns to a government. I mean, in normal conditions, who has authority over Brazilian people? The Brazilian government. Okay, you may disagree for contingent reasons. We may all have a series of issues. Okay, maybe Brazil is not the best example. But,
Right.
yeah. Okay, but in general, you see the point. I mean, unless something serious happens, the only political authority that has authority over people is its government. When this authority is either directly responsible for a serious violation of human rights or the omission of taking certain initiatives leads to serious violations of human rights, remember the responsibility to protect, basically genocide, ethnic cleansing, then that government, that state loses its authority. So the essence, the heart of human rights, as Alan Buchanan puts it, is precisely this limitation of national authority, determination of the conditions on which national authority rests. Now, most of the political scholars, let's call it this way, are non-committal regarding the possibility of having a moral foundation of human rights. So they are not saying the idea that these rights that are now parts of the international law reflect pre-existing moral rights that have been determined by, moral thinking, or that are given to us by God, or whatever source of these moral rights could be, are not there. They say it's not necessary to invoke these moral rights that superimpose, so to speak, on these already existing international rights, pieces of international law, in order to justify the latter. So you can have a sufficient account of what human rights are, remaining non-committal to the existence of a deeper or higher level from which these legal rights, pieces of international law, are supposed to rest on. They believe that nothing essential is left out if we justify human rights by looking at the role that they have come to play in the practice of human rights. So the essence of human rights is that of defining the limits of sovereignty, as I said, and their foundation, assuming that this is a distinct question from the question of what is the essence of human rights, is nothing but the de facto universal or quasi-universal acceptance of these limits by institutions around the world. I mean, at least officially, there is no government today that says, even if a genocide happens somewhere in the world, the only legitimate authority is the government under which this genocide happens. It's very strange to hear an argument like that. Sometimes China makes this kind of argument. I mean, whatever happens within the Chinese territory, it's the competence of the Chinese government, period. But, especially if we talk about massive and serious violation of human rights, it's very unusual to hear people saying, the international community has no right to intervene when these things happen, and of course when the local authority have proven either unwilling or unable to do anything to stop or prevent that kind of massive violation. To put it with Rawls' succinct description, human rights, quote, restrict the justifying reason for war and its conduct, and they specify limits to a regime's internal authority. So, Notice the reference to just war. As I told you, according to the mainstream orientation in political philosophy, which tends to be according to liberal political philosophy, I don't know if Alessandro agrees with that, but at least in terms of quantity of people belonging to the liberal family, there are only two reasons that justify war. One is self-defense, the other one is precisely the protection of human rights, which is not a self-defense, because sometimes you are supposed to fight not because you have been attacked, but because some serious violation happens, who knows where, with all the difficulties that we simply mentioned yesterday without digging into them. Okay, so there are, as in the first two families, different variations within this school. Tasiulas, for example, distinguishes who does not belong to the political view. If anything, Tasiulas is not a political scholar, but he distinguishes between a subset view and a sui generis view. So, subset and sui generis. The subset view holds that the political sovereignty limiting dimension of human rights is just the necessary complement to whatever normative force human rights already have from other sources. So, for example, you may think that the normativity of human rights derives from some account of human dignity. The point of the subset view is simply to say, okay, but don't forget also this role of national sovereignty limitation, because this is a necessary component of what human rights are. It's not something that you can, it's not something that can be left outside of a satisfying account of what human rights are. Whereas the sui generis view, that is a much stronger position, says that nothing but this political function that human rights play has to enter into the essence of human rights. So the sui generis view holds that the normative essence of human rights is exhausted by the political function that we have explained, and any reference to an underlying layer of universal moral rights is at best superfluous, if not misleading. I mean, we will be seeing with Waldron in the second part of this lecture that there are scholars who really believe that any mentioning of human dignity is not only unnecessary but pretty much misleading. So these are examples of sui generis view. Now, of course, if you want to criticize the political view, you better not argue against the subset orientation, because pretty much nobody denies that human rights, that a necessary component of human rights today is the role of limiting national sovereignty. It would be crazy to deny that, you know, part of the essence of human rights is precisely that. So as long as the political view is reduced to the idea that, oh, don't forget about this role of limitation of national sovereignty, it's really not interesting, because nobody denies that there is this role. When the political view becomes interesting is that when it says that you should make reference only to this role and to any other political role that human rights may play for international politics, that becomes a distinct position, that becomes a true challenge to the other two. Okay, so what's wrong with the political view? Well, there are many roads that you may take to criticize the political view. I'm going to explain what bothers me in most. It's not necessarily an exhaustive account of the criticism you may have against the political view. Well, one thing you could say is that the political view makes human rights dependent on the existence of the state system. If the essence of human rights is the limitation of national authority, if there were to be no states, it seems that there would be no human rights, right? Because then there is nothing to limit. It's the very object that is supposed to be the focus of human rights that comes to be no longer there. But I think that the most serious problem for the political view is the fact that it violates what Joshua Cohen in 2006 called the fidelity condition. What is the fidelity condition? Okay, remember when we were talking about methodology yesterday, and I told you one fascinating thing about the philosophy of human rights is that unlike moral theory, you are not supposed to philosophize from nowhere, so to speak, and come up with the essential of morality, even if, I don't know, people around the world think that the essence of morality is very different from your theory. So you know, when you do pure moral theory, you don't, it's not entirely true, but I guess that you are more allowed to ignore what common sense thinks about morality. Okay, you may end up with the idea that what is moral is what maximizes the utility of a community, and end up with the famous counterintuitive consequences that sometimes you need to sacrifice the interest of some for the sake of the maximization of the good of the community. It is pretty much counterintuitive, but a utilitarian and hardcore utilitarian might think, I don't care whether you people think that it's not right to sacrifice the property or even the life, perhaps, of some individuals for the maximization of the interest of the community, because that's what my theory has shown, that if you really want to be an egalitarian, if you want to, you know, I don't know, care about what really matters for a society, that is its flourishing, the flourishing of the society, then you have to face bravely these counterintuitive consequences. Okay, this kind of reasoning, assuming that moral theorists reason in this way with no concern with the intuitions that we have about morality, which is pretty much not the case, but assuming for the sake of the argument that that's what moral philosophers do, it is certainly the case that philosophers of human rights are not allowed to think in these terms. So the idea is, you may come up with a wonderful philosophical approach, philosophical account of human rights, if this account leads you to think that torture is okay for the sake of security, well, your theory is not acceptable. Not because it's philosophically wrong, because it's so distant from the way in which human rights are understood by people, ordinary people around the world, by what sometimes is referred to as the culture of human rights, that you have to change your theory, basically. If you think that democracy might not be a human right, then we can discuss, we can talk about that. Because democracy may not be included in the list of human rights, and excluding democracy does not conflict with our intuition so strongly or so powerfully in the same way in which it does when you say that avoidance of genocide is not a concern for human rights. That would not be acceptable. So pretty much this is what the fidelity condition is about. Any theory that you may have about human rights has to be faithful to the culture of human rights. It doesn't have to conflict too immediately and strongly with the way in which human rights are understood in the world. Now, why do I think that the political view violates the fidelity condition? The political view, I think, is particularly bound to the constraint that the way is particularly bound to the fidelity condition, precisely because the essence of human rights for the political orientation is what human rights are. So one would not expect that the theory that says that all there is to say about human rights is what they do as a matter of fact, end up with construing human rights in a way that conflicts with what human rights do. Now, it is, I think, highly dubious that the very idea of reducing the normativity of human rights, the sui generis view, to the function they play in international politics is compatible with the practice of human rights. To begin with, the main human rights document from the Universal Declaration all introduce human rights as an expression of the intrinsic dignity of the human being. Keeping the central intuition of natural law and natural rights, according to some ancestors of human rights, they construe the normativity of these rights, the documents construe the normativity of these rights as fully independent of states, institutions, established patterns of international politics. So if you look at the documents, they don't say, there is already this practice of limiting national sovereignty depending on whether there are serious violation of certain moral values or certain things, and therefore here is the list of the things that have already been established. I mean, the documents seem to go the other way around. They seem to say, well, there is a moral world that is already accepted, there is inherent dignity of the human being, and what the list of human rights that we are going to give you in these documents is nothing but an expression in the weak version, or even something that can be inferred, like the covenants say, from this pre-existing and completely non-political moral value that is often described as human dignity. So when you ask yourself whether the political orientation is faithful to the culture and practice of human rights, the first problem you have is that the main documents seem to go in a completely different direction. Now, in fact, precisely because human rights are often conceived as independent of political authorities, independent of political institutions, it's precisely because of this independence that they can limit the authority of states and assess critically politics as it is traditionally carried out. So it seems that intrinsic in the very idea of human rights is that they must be conceived as something pre-political. They may not be merely moral rights, okay, but they cannot be merely political rights, because if you reduce them to political rights, you make them dependent on an institutional scheme, whereas their function seems to be the ability to criticize the institutional scheme where individuals live. I mean, human rights are tools in the hands of individuals to criticize the institutions they live in. And in order to have this critical function, they cannot be reduced to merely political rights. So an alternative way of seeing the same problem could be expressed in this way. Certainly human rights have come to play the function on which the political view insists. What remains obscure is why human rights are to be conceived as nothing but instruments of that specific political function. If the answer is that this is what the practice has made of them, then we need to be very clear to what practice we are appealing to. Certainly this practice is neither the way in which human rights were presented in the official documents, as I've shown, nor the way in which they are usually understood by common people. So defenders of the political view, I think at this point, could draw a distinction between the contemporary culture of human rights, the way in which common sense understands of them, that seems to me is pretty much at odds with the political orientation. So the culture of human rights on the one hand and the practice of human rights on the other. And the political view may say, okay, yes, we do not respect the fidelity condition if you think of the culture of human rights, but we certainly respect the fidelity condition if you talk about the practice of human rights, because that's what we are saying, right? That human rights are nothing but what they do in international politics. The problem with this kind of distinction between the culture and the problem and the practice is twofold. On the one hand, in acknowledging its distance from the culture of human rights, the political view concedes that it violates the fidelity condition the way in which it's usually understood, because the fidelity condition is mainly about the way in which people think of human rights, what they do with them in their political action. On the other hand, in focusing exclusively on the practice, which is, by the way, narrowly defined to include only certain patterns of international politics, what sometimes is called the ordinary phase of human rights. So what international lawyers do with human rights, the reduction of the practice to what international lawyers do with human rights, because if by practice you also mean the activism that is behind human rights, then is even more difficult for the political orientation to say that they are respecting the fidelity condition, because what people protest about when they appeal to human rights in the streets, they do not have necessarily, mainly they do not have in mind pieces of international law. They go there because they think that their dignity or the dignity of other human beings has been violated. So if by practice we mean the way in which human rights are practiced by activists, it's questionable whether all there is to them is this function, this political function that the political view focuses on. Finally, it seems to me that the problem with the political orientation, as I was already mentioning yesterday in response to your colleague that was mentioning Russ, is that it makes human rights too dependent on the status quo. So the way in which we today understand human rights. Because if all there is to human rights is the role that they play today, the way in which they have come to be accepted in international treaties, in international law, in the practice of human rights jurists, judges, and so on and so forth, then at least I, don't see how you can explain the fact that human rights evolve and may change. We may, take one human right out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because we don't think there is any human right to paid holidays. We may want to insert a new human right within that list. And this idea of adjusting the list that we have, the conception that we have of human rights, seems to be hard to accommodate for a view that reduces the essence of human rights to their role in international politics. Okay, let me stop here and ask whether there are questions on either of the things that we have said so far. Incidentally, this is the first time I give a seminar on human rights, not having people presenting the materials that I'm supposed to talk about. So you make me work a lot, because I usually make students work and do what I'm doing right now. So it's very unfair, but I'm joking. No, I'm happy to do it. I'm only saying that if some brave volunteer wants to present a part of the material that still needs to be discussed, so either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, there are not many options. I mean, let me know and I'll be happy, of course, to help you with that. And so if you want to make this exercise, I think that we are all here to learn, so it may even be nice for other people to hear different voices. But having said that, let me ask you if something is not clear. Sure.
Professor, two questions. First one, seems to me that the way you have presented the fidelity condition, isn't it a bit circular, if I argue with that? And the second one, the criticism about talking about independency, the human rights dependency on the state, isn't it a bit strange, because in some way there will always be states above the discussion? For instance, if we talk about national states, in some way there will be a multinational organization such as the United Nations, which is legitimate to impose the decisions all the states once have agreed to apply and to obey. So there will always be a higher sphere in which human rights will be treated as a part of a higher organism.
Well, I think that let me start with this. The objection is that the political views seem to omit to exclude the possibility that one day we will be living under a war government. If there were only a war government, the objection goes, I'm not saying I agree completely with it, then this role of human rights of limiting the authority of states seem to be lost, because there are no more states to be limited in their authority over their people. If we live in a cosmopolitan world where there is only one government that encompasses the whole earth, then you are in trouble, because you have said that the whole point of human rights is to limit the authority of to limit the power and the authority of national states. Now, the political view could say, no. Well, if I express myself in this way, I misspoke. But what I meant is that human rights would have a place also in a cosmopolitan world, because they would be limiting the authority of the war government. up to a point, because as you, I think, were mentioning, at this point, who is the authority that checks on the world government? So if human rights are conceived merely in political terms, then we no longer have, strictly speaking, human rights in this world, because there is no higher authority that can check on a lower political authority. Whereas, of course, non-instrumentalism does not have this problem, because it says human rights are mainly moral rights. If a world government turns into the bad dictatorship that can't fear, so if the world government misbehaves, I have intellectual space to say, no, that is a violation of human rights, because human rights do not depend on institutions. So there is a problem for the political view, as long as, because it is committed to the existence of national states, it seems to me. That's the second question you had. The first one is the fidelity condition circular. Well, I'm tempted to answer yes, but in a positive way. It's circular in the sense, I mean, I think what you have in mind is the fidelity conditions seem to impose on us the philosophical bias of saying that human rights are what we already know that they are. And no, I would resist this idea and say that the fidelity condition imposes on you not to have a theory that is too distant from the way in which human rights are usually conceived of. Being not too distant is not the same thing as being identical with. So, of course, then there is a question of where you draw the line, when distant becomes too distant. But I think that intuitively we know pretty well what it means to have a theory that is too distant from the way in which human rights are usually conceived. I was mentioning before, if you come up with a purely utilitarian approach to human rights, chances are that you are going to be too distant, because, of course, as any rights talk, human rights are essentially individualistic. So our protection of the individual to begin with, and not protection of communities over the rights of the individual. It's the other way around, right? Human rights, like any rights, protect, as Dworkin famously puts it, are trump cards against the search for the common good. So I don't care whether by taking all my property you are going to increase the national economy, because if this is my property, even if I agree with you that stealing from me would make the life better for many other people, still this is not okay. So I think that intuitively we know what we don't mean by all means by human rights.
But isn't it a bit tricky to say it depends on the intuition? It's like common sense. Everyone does have his own idea of common sense.
No, I don't think so, because well, look, that's a very, very good point, of course. Okay, two things. First thing I want to say is that it's surprising how human rights are conceived in fairly uniform and cross-cultural ways across the globe. Let me give you this example. I mean, a couple of years ago there was the world survey. I mean, there are political scientists who check on the values that people have, profess to have at least. Now, one of the things that these political scientists were asking is questions like, do you think that men and women should have exactly the same rights in the society? And they would ask these questions in Germany and in Saudi Arabia. Okay? Now, in Germany, predictably the answer was 95% yes. And it would be interesting to meet the 5% that said no, women and men should not have exactly the same rights in the society. Now you go to Saudi Arabia, and what do you expect? You expect that only 40% of the population say that men and women should have exactly the same rights. The percentage is 80%. So what does suggest, at least I'm not saying that it's rock bottom argument, but what it suggests is that, you know, the issue of cultural specificity and the parochialism objection, this fact that we don't want to impose Western values, that the idea of equality is only a Western thing, that the fact that women should not be discriminated is only in Europe and in the rest of the liberal world, and so on. Up to a point. I mean, another fascinating thing of human rights is really that by now, at least after 70 years, is a common language, it's a common normative language that is spoken across cultures. So, you had a question? Sorry. So why did I mention this? Because you said, because appealing to the way in which human rights are understood could lead you to, okay, I understand that by human rights, you understand completely different things. No, that's really not the case. It's not the case for the reason that I've just given you, that the differences in moral sensitivities are